The rising inequality and growing political instability that we see today are the direct result of decades of bad economic theory.
The last 5 decades of trickle-down economics haven't worked. But what's the alternative?
Middle-out economics is the answer.
Because the middle class is the source of growth, not its consequence.
That's right.
This is Pitchfork Economics with Nick Hanauer, a podcast about how to build the economy from the middle out. Welcome to the show.
Well, Goldy, I know you know that if there's anything that has pissed me off over the last couple of 3 years in the academic economic discourse, it has been about inflation. And,
Right.
I've just found this conversation.
For you, it must have been really painful for you to go through all this inflation, Nick. Do you look at prices?
No,
I don't know how
ever,
to know.
ever. But it doesn't matter. It was still stupid and counterproductive. And the narratives around what was causing it and what we should do about it, I just consistently felt like we're, missed the mark. And so that is why I am incredibly excited to have our friend, political economist Mark Blyth, back on the program to talk about his new book, Inflation, A Guide for Users and Losers. Because, this book and Mark and his co-author generally have decomposed the problem of inflation, I think, in really thoughtful and nuanced ways, which you obviously have to. It's obviously a complicated problem, and being Larry Summers and saying, okay, the way to handle this is to cause a giant recession and have 7 or 8 or 9% of the people unemployed for a few years to solve it it's just criminally stupid.
To be fair to Larry, that's about the level of detailed analysis you can fit into a tweet.
That's true. That's true. But anyway,
and that's what's really important is how many
what's really
Twitter
important.
followers you have.
I just think that this is a really important thing for people to understand. And, it's sadly, it's not simple. There aren't simple answers here, but I think that's part of the point. So, with that, I think we should go talk to Mark and see what he thinks.
I'm Mark Blyth. I am a professor and a political economist at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island in the United States. And I'm the author of the Financial Times Best Books for the Summer 2025. Woo! There we go. Inflation, A Guide for Users and Losers.
I love it. Well, Mark, it's great to have you here, and it's great to have somebody from the world of political economy and economics. Share that joke with us that you were just what did Lyndon Baines Johnson say?
Yeah, Lyndon Baines Johnson once famously said, if you took all the economists in Washington, D.C. and laid them end to end, they might reach a conclusion.
So good.
Yeah, this is really fun for me because I'm looking at my screen now, and on my left I have a self-loathing economist, and on my right I have a self-loathing billionaire. So, and I'm just self-loathing about everything. So it's going to be a real fun conversation.
Let's see if we can plumb new depths.
So you wrote a book about inflation.
I did.
And in spite of everything, I think it's super timely because, having gone through the global supply chain shock and the pandemic, no issue was more salient or important in the public discourse than the issue of inflation, which we were convinced the whole time the government of the United States of America mostly got wrong.
Yeah.
That they mistook a wage price spiral for a global supply chain shock. And the Fed, in their infinite wisdom, applied the only tool that they have available, which is interest rates, in a dumb and unproductive way. And so your book seeks to sort of decompose the elements of inflation and offer us kind of a better path forward. But if you could just sort of lay out your general thesis and try to bring our listeners up to speed on what the issue really is about.
And let's start with the definition, what inflation is, because as I understand it, reading headlines, it's solely the price of eggs.
You might think that, particularly if you live in the US. All right, so inflation, to quote Mrs. Thatcher, is a rise in the general level of all prices. It is not houses getting expensive. It is not stocks going up. It's when all prices go up. Now, why did we get interested in this? Two reasons, me and my co-author, Nick. The first one is the distributional impact. We're always told that we all suffer from inflation. That's simply not true.
That's bullshit.
Right. But the thing is, most people don't know that, so it's worth pointing it out, right? That essentially this is a tax on consumption. And if you're in an income distribution where you're at the wrong end of it, then you consume more of your income. So that directly hits you. A very simple way to think about it is if you shop at Dollar General and you've got a serious inflation, your family's going to hurt. If you're shopping at Whole Foods, you actually are impervious to inflation because you've been paying 30% more than your groceries you should be for the past 10 years. So with income comes, if you will, an inflation hedge. The second thing we wanted to get into is precisely this thing about what the hell is this? Because we've got the other great quote about inflation is it's from Milton Friedman. It's always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And the Fed used to have a poster apparently hanging around that said, shootings are always and everywhere a ballistic phenomena, right? In other words, you know it's involved, but it's not necessarily causal. So what we wanted to do is to say, all right, given the stories that are emerging in 2021, right, there were 4 distinct inflation narratives about what was causing this. We wanted to essentially track that through, see how that played out, which ones the central banks went for, and so on and so forth. And also to just go back and look at the 70s, which seems to be the big playbook for inflation and why we raise interest rates, and go back and reinterrogate that and see if we actually really were getting the right lessons from that period. So that's basically what the book tries to do.
Well, let's start with the 4 narratives.
Sure. All right, so narrative number 1, Larry Summers comes out and says there's been too much money spent by the federal government and we need to basically cause a recession by jacking up interest rates, and there'll be 5% unemployment for 3 years or 7%, whatever it was, blah, blah, blah. He made it all up. Yeah. Anyway, that's a standard stock view, right? That's that the government spent too much. Easy way to think about this. How many countries suffered inflation between 21 and 24? 30. How many of them had Biden stimulus checks? 1. You can't do it that way, right? So narrative number 2, you mentioned wage price spirals. The labor market. Labor market's super tight because of the conditions of the pandemic and people going home. And as we open that up, the economy is supply constrained. So what will happen is people will ask for wage rises. And those wage rises will cause price rises, and wage rises cause price rises. And then we end up as Venezuela. Well, that's simply not true, because the last time that happened, and it's even dubious if it actually happened, the famous wage price spirals in the 1970s, the IMF went back and looked at it and went, actually, these things hardly ever happen. But they only work when you've got a relatively closed economy with big unions that can actually effectively strike. And we haven't had that for 30 years, so there's no way you get that push from the labour market. The third one was the one that's associated with Paul Krugman, which was actually kind of more right than the rest, which was the team transitory. Ultimately, these are just 2 big supply shocks that happened all at once. For Europe, it's energy. For America, it's basically global supply chains. When all of this shakes out and the supply side adjusts, this too will pass. And that's pretty much what actually happened. And the last one, particularly relevant in the European case, was price gouging by corporations. And we can talk about eggs if you want as the classic example of this. But the European Central Bank actually estimated that for 2022, 40% of the inflation that was felt was generated came from corporations pushing up prices. So essentially, in terms of...
And if I could just interject, it wasn't that they just pushed up prices. They expanded their margins.
Yeah, they expanded the margins, right? Absolutely.
So they became more profitable.
Yes, absolutely.
So their inputs did increase.
Yeah.
But they increased their margins more than the increases.
That's exactly right.
That were then passed on to consumers.
Yeah. Isabella Weber calls this seller's inflation. I like to call it, well, you would if you could, wouldn't you inflation. Because the whole purpose of a firm is to make money. Prices become unanchored. If you didn't do that, you wouldn't be doing your job. So of course you could expect firms to do this. So those were the 4 main narratives. And basically we're like, okay, so how does this play out? And the take home is essentially narratives 3 and 4 were right. Narratives 1 and 2 really weren't. And that's the playbook of the 70s. So then the really interesting question becomes, why do these guys always go back to these stories about the labor market and the government spending too much money?
So why do they? Because it just seemed obvious to me that those things were not true. I mean,
right, but see, here's a standard story of the 70s that you might agree with, and then let's play with it a little bit, right? So what happened in the 70s? Well, Bretton Woods ended. There was inflation coming through the dollar channel. You ran these full employment-based economies that were relatively closed. You had unions. They were able to strike. You did get wages pushing up prices beyond productivity. Investment fell, you got stagflation, and ultimately inflation's a tax on profits, capital rebels, and you get the 1980s and where we go from there, right? That story's not wrong. Now let's insert the sort of the central banks into this. What's the lesson that's learned? Politicians are, as they say, time inconsistent, so they will spend more money than they promise to, even if there's an inflation. So you have to take the tools away from the kiddies, and that gives us independent central banks. And we know this worked because Paul Volcker came along, jacked up interest rates to nearly 20%, and he caused a huge recession. But by 1984, it was morning in America, and everything's fine. So that's what we know to do. Now, that's the standard story everybody gets from the 1970s. What's wrong with that story? It's incomplete.
We're missing the oil shock for one.
Yeah, there was an oil shock.
I'm getting to. Give me a second.
Right.
Here's an alternative story of the 1970s, and Alan Blinder has actually been writing this in a series of papers for 20 years, right? So what happens is the first one is Vietnam War's fought off the books. Right, and you effectively have 2% unemployment in 1968, massive labour market overstimulation. Then you incorporate women and minorities into the labour market as the first time, and they're actually as consumers, not just people who are going to push down wages. They actually consume more. Then you got failed harvests. These were big events because it triggers lots of global commodity shocks. The biggest one is the 74 oil shock. You got 79 oil shock. You got mad little things like the mortgage prices being put in the CPI in 1978. So there was another way of thinking about the 70s is a whole series of supply shocks that all came, each one of them went up and then went down, but they all came together, kind of like London buses. They all came at once, right? And were these labour market dynamics there? Yeah, but really what was going on is a whole ton of supply shocks, right? And if you just waited, this is Alan Blinder's argument, if you just waited, Paul didn't need to shove up interest rates that much. It was already on its way out. Now, if that's the case, why do you then reach for interest rates every time? Because ultimately these banks have got two tools: buy and sell assets, raise and lower the price of cash. That's it.
That's it. And if they just feel like they have to do something.
They got to do something because, in a sense, look, a little bit of sympathy here, right? Politicians for the past 30 years have been told they can't do anything, they shouldn't do anything, fiscal policy is bad, taxing and spending is really bad. They've given it all to the central banks. It was all great when everything was the great moderation, and when it went to shit, we said, lads, save the system. They've got two tools, and they've been using them ever since.
That's right. So I just want to make an amendment to your analysis that makes today different than the 70s, and why I think the Krugman analysis is wrong in the sense that it's transitory. The big difference between now and the 70s is corporate concentration.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And that makes a huge difference when it comes to whether higher prices are transitory or not, because higher prices are only transitory if there's real competition.
That's right.
If there's not real competition in markets, profit margins expand, and then they expand more, and they expand more, and they expand more. And that is the story of the American economy since the 1970s or 60s, right? Corporate profits used to be 5% of GDP. Now they're 12% of GDP. There is nothing that will stop them from going to 15% of GDP. And wages as a percent of GDP have fallen by exactly that amount.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally buy that. I mean, the question is, this is the egg thing, right? Why are Canadian eggs, because they had bird flu as well, $2 cheaper than American eggs? And it's because you have hundreds of thousands of producers, but you have two buyers, right? And that's exactly the market concentration. Thomas Philippon did a great book on this a few years ago on basically the paradox of America and Europe. Europe has freer markets because of competition policy and a lack of concentration because it's, lots of different small economies. But I don't think that that's wrong at all. You see this with levels, the focus on levels, right? When prices go up, they don't come down. Right. That's it. Right. You go to a restaurant now and it's not like, oh, it's back to where it was in 2021. No, absolutely not. Right.
Absolutely
No, totally
not.
Buy that. I buy that, Nick.
And in your book, you make the argument that you don't expect we're going to return to the low inflation we had over the past 3 decades or so.
Yeah, because if you think about it, right, the standard story, if you extend it to the 80s, and once we gave the central banks all that power, they credibly signaled their intentions to financial markets and labor market participants, and they revised down their expectations, and everything was fine. Alternatively, 500 million Chinese workers joined the global economy. The IT revolution met the container ship. Technology changed. We became far less industrially dependent, much more service-oriented, and you end up with a lower inflation economy for 30 years as a one-time trick. The central banks were just bystanders rather than active participants.
That's a very interesting analysis. Can you just unpack that a little bit more, this 30-year one-time trick? That went by fast, and that's quite interesting.
Paul Volcker joves up interest rates at the same time they deregulate financial markets. And what that does is create a huge supply of expensive credit for a huge pent-up demand of credit that's been there since the 70s. And basically the US financial sector and the London financial sector did the same. And they ran down that spread for the next 30 years. That's what they did. Now, how does inflation fit into this? Well, you're no longer creating the type of hothouse economies where labor can create a wage price spiral or any of this sort of stuff. Capital has been actively moving out first to right-to-work states and then to Mexico and China for the past 30 years. And when you do this and you basically integrate the Chinese economy, particularly after 2000, you're adding massive deflationary pressure to the whole global economy. But it's a bit like bank deregulation, right? Once you deregulate them, you can't do it twice.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
This was like remember Liz Truss, the one who was the Prime Minister for 5 minutes?
Yeah,
right?
for 2 weeks, yeah.
For 2 weeks. That was her whole thing, was like, we're going to do Thatcherism again. And everyone was like, you can't.
She was going to run the Reagan-Thatcher playbook again.
I know. But once you've done the banks, you can't do them again, right? And it's once you've done China.
Even the bankers knew that.
Right, I know, exactly. But once you do China, you can't do China again. Now China is basically a middle-income country, right? And basically wages are higher. They're on the technological frontier of more stuff than we are. The world has shifted. And, maybe you're going to get deflationary forces because China's addicted to sending exports everywhere for various reasons. But that one-time trick from China, that's not coming back.
Yeah, that's super. That's super interesting.
Well, we can always continue to cut taxes on billionaires, right? Because we're not at zero yet. So there's plenty of room there.
I don't even know why you need to do that, because as Nick will tell us, right, Nick doesn't have any income. You simply pledge your assets for loans, and then you pay back the loan. So your real effective tax rate is the interest rate on the loan. Why do billionaires need tax cuts when they don't have any income? That's the bit I don't understand.
Right. Well, this is why we should tax the proceeds on those loans.
But we digress. I thought one of the interesting points that you made was drawing a distinction between good inflation and bad inflation.
Yeah.
Because moderate inflation is not a terrible thing for an economy, and in many ways it's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, essentially, bad inflation is the type whereby you end up as Argentina, an extremist, right? Yeah. And why does Malay succeed in putting together that coalition against anti-inflation? Because if you've got 50% of Argentines under the poverty line and you've got systematically strong inflation, you're just pummeling the bottom 50% of your population. They will do anything to get relief from this. That's bad. That's seriously bad. Now, what is good inflation? You want to have some degree of sort of nominal price movement. You want to have the ability to grow without it bumping up against supply constraints, right? That's basically why they try and target 2%. Should it be 2%? Should it be 3%? It's not an unreasonable way of thinking about things. Although there's another school that would say, but when you do that, it's too low. You're putting a limit on growth. This goes back to when Trump had his first spat with the Fed in 2017. And Trump was saying, run the economy hot. Don't you dare raise interest rates. You're going to kill it. And that time, actually, the Fed didn't do it. And then you got a real rise in real wages for the bottom 40%, which is one of the reasons that Trump remains popular in that cohort.
Interesting. The other thing that you try to do is organize a policy response. And you note that Spain's price controls kind of worked. Hungary's did not.
Right.
But I think this all speaks to how this is a complicated problem that needs to be addressed in nuanced ways.
That's exactly it. It's basically, the cliche is the Swiss Army penknife approach rather than the Bowie knife. So if you think about what central banks actually did this time around, right, all the stuff we're talking about, they know this. Huge part of the research for the book was reading the research output of the central banks. Notice not one central bank actually raised their policy rate above the rate of inflation in their country. None of them pulled a Volcker. Everyone got close to the rate of inflation. And was it even close enough to have an effect? Employment went up in the first year rather than down, right? So that whole effect that it was meant to have didn't happen. Essentially, they kind of like performed raising interest rates, and there was a whole bunch of other policies going on the side in lots of different countries. Some of which could be called price controls, price floors, price ceilings, the German gas brake, all sorts of stuff. Some of them worked, some of them didn't, but it really is a kind of like whole of the Swiss Army penknife approach.
Was the Fed conscious that it was merely being performative? Because it clearly did not achieve its proximate goal, which was to slow the economy and raise unemployment.
Right. But then again, what they would respond is, no, that's not our goal. Our goal is to change the delta on inflation and make it point down the way. And we will raise rates to a point where we think it's going to have that effect. Now, were they really doing that? Is that what actually happened, or was it just the supply shock eventually, dissipated? Right? They're going to claim victory one way or another. I mean, it was all sort of like Goldilocks stuff, etc. And you can't prove it, you can't disprove it. So of course they're going to talk their book. I mean, that's basically it. I'm
just wondering though. I know what they say publicly, and the Fed is famously famous for,
yes.
Being very careful about what they say publicly, because deep down they think inflation is merely, do you think there's going to be inflation?
Right.
It's an expectations game. But do you have an idea of what they actually understand internally about what they did and what happened? Did they learn any lessons?
So we can't go and ask them directly. So what we did instead, Nick and I, in an academic paper, was to take all the central bank speeches from the big three banks, the ECB, the Fed, and the Bank of England, and we basically ran it through an LLM, through a large language model, and we got them to look for our inflation narratives. So basically, every time they talk about fiscal policy and inflation, every time they talk about price gouging and inflation. And what you see is there's real differences amongst the central banks. The Europeans actually talk a lot about price gouging. The Fed actually doesn't really talk about government spending. It looks at the labor market. The Brits, who never spend any money, strangely spend their time looking at government spending. But what you find overall is, as you get through the sort of the COVID period, by the time you get to about 2023, they're actually all willing to entertain different things, which either suggests confusion or an open mind. Make your mind up as to which one it is.
Can you speak to what the differences were between Spain and Hungary?
Sure. So basically, what we're looking for is this notion that we never do price controls is bullshit, right? If you look at electricity markets, there's price controls all over the place, right? If you think about the American healthcare system, it's a giant free market with no prices. Every price is negotiated between brokers, right? So the notion that we allow markets to work all the time is complete rubbish. And we looked at some of the more interesting examples of price control. So what they did in Spain was they said, all right, we know if we start saying the price of flour is X, there'll be a shortage of flour and it won't work. So if you want to protect consumers at the bottom 20% of the income distribution, they're the ones that tend to use public transport. How about we just make that free? And that frees up part of their budget, which will accommodate a little bit of like the expenditure that they're going to get the hit with inflation. That was a smart way of doing it. The Italians looked at their banks and said, okay, so let me get this straight. This ECB's now got a policy rate of nearly 5%, and you're still giving people 0.5% on their savings accounts. In other words, you're capturing the net interest margin.
Yeah.
Right. So we're going to tax you on that. So they taxed them for several billion on that one and then used that to redistribute. Then there were like bad examples of this. Hungary basically said, you will set the price at the supermarket. And the supermarket shelves emptied, exactly as Econ 101 would predict. And then in Scotland, they tried to freeze rents and secure tenancies for people who were renters. And the problem with that was they basically left out the Airbnb sector. And what that meant was that the people who are landlords immediately turned themselves into Airbnbs, and rents went up by a third as the supply collapsed. So the take-home lesson on this is be careful what you're doing with this stuff. Broad things, like basically what Spain was doing, actually they're not so complex. Anything that's technical and can be gamed will be gamed.
Right. Interesting. So let's get to more of what you would do. If you had been president of the United States.
President or Fed Reserve Chair?
No, president. Who knows? I don't know. If you had been in charge.
If I was Emperor Blyth the First.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Emperor Blyth. If we rewind to 2019, 2020, what would you have done in hindsight?
Right, in hindsight. I think the lesson of the book actually kind of emerges out of the end of it when you write it and you kind of really realize the story you've got, which is central banks think about supply shocks as something that they see through. Because as you pointed out, Goldy, they've got this expectations model of inflation, right? And one of the things we found out in the book is we went to try and find any evidence for this being true, whether it's academic or survey-based or whatever. And people definitely have expectations of how the price level is going to go. But it's things like, are you a Republican when the Democrats are in power? Right? They have price expectations based upon gasoline prices. Why? Because they pump gas twice a week and they look at the price, and that's their price index. The notion that anybody's listening to central banks' inflation forecasts, even in the financial sector, is actually surprisingly hard to find. So what I would do is to say, why are we looking through supply shocks? Why do we not take them seriously and think about if these things are going to have an inflationary effect? And if they are, then you've got a couple of options. You can, as Isabella Weber suggests, have buffer stocks, right? We used to do that. There used to be a global wheat buffer stock in case wheat prices failed because you don't want mass starvation, right? Problem with that stuff is it's expensive because you could have done something else with the money. And if you don't use it, people get pissed off, right?
Yes.
But there are other ways that
you're wasting money.
You're wasting money, right? There are other things you can do as well. It's sort of like, interest rates, yes, they're a powerful instrument, but we saw this time that essentially you're not really willing to use the nuclear option on them, and it's not even clear that that was the deciding element in pulling inflation back down. So if that's the case, let's actually have a good think about how a central bank might respond in other ways. Maybe it could do it through credit policy. Maybe it could do it through basically acting through different channels of liquidity rather than just interest rates. Or maybe it's something that you take out away from the central bank, as the Spanish do, and you do basically more at a fiscal level in terms of what you really want to do with inflation is make sure that those people who are most affected, right, the bottom 40%, aren't actually unnecessarily scalped. Now, they're the people, for example, that already pay the most for their credit. They're on payday loans, all the shitty credit products, right? And then when you raise interest rates, they get a double whammy, right?
Double whammy, right.
And if you're at the top end, like the three of us, right? I've got this house with a studio in it, right? This is an inflation hedge, right? Yeah. I own stuff that are financial instruments. You push up interest rates, I make more money. Surely we can think about how we would distribute those windfall gains to cushion the inflationary shock at the bottom. That would be good for society overall, and that goes beyond thinking about interest rates.
I mean, again, like one of the central challenges the American economy faces, and whether you're in an inflationary scenario or not, is corporate concentration, right? Mm-hmm. Which increases prices, decreases wages, slows innovation, the rest of it, right? Unfortunately, that is a very hard problem to quickly solve. Would you have intervened in the corporate greed?
So it's hard to do because if you want to do it fairly and you don't want to screw it up in the process, you'd actually need to know what their input costs are.
Yeah.
Right? So
you could just watch their margin expansion, right? Like, who cares what their inputs are? Right? If your after-tax profits went from 6% to 9%.
Right, but it could also be windfall. It could be because other factors have done this. It's a kind of big ceteris paribus, all things remaining equal on that one, and it seldom isn't. There's also the question of how concentrated are some markets. Some are obviously incredibly concentrated, like General Mills, right? But and cereal markets, right? But the price of cereal didn't go up as much as some other stuff, and things like the egg flu, the chicken flu, whatever it is, bird flu, also added to these pressures in other places. So I mean, this is why antitrust is sort of like really popular as an idea and kind of hard to do.
Yes.
Because, back in the day, like when you do the Sherman Act, right, you just simply look at Morgan and go, you're toast, we're going to take all this stuff from you, we're going to shut it up, right? You go to 1980, you take the bells, you just cut them up, right, we do different things, dead easy. It's not clear what you do with Google, right? Yeah. It's not clear what you do with Insta. Right, so when you've got a very different type of economy, this is why Lena Khan was like really interesting. Like she's really tried to do this stuff, but it just wasn't obvious what you did in some of these cases, and it's obvious in other ones. But I'll give you an example on this. You're going to love, right? So America's got the high chicken prices, like one of the egg prices. One of the two main companies that pull chicken and eggs, of course, is Purdue. Pop quiz: who was Trump's agriculture secretary in the first administration? Sonny Perdue. Right, there you go. It writes itself.
Well, so that leaves you with, I don't want to use the term price controls, but when you have something like Google, if you regulate it like a utility, we regulate utilities.
Yeah, well, that's an honest way of thinking about it. I mean, what we did was, one of the reasons it's so hard to get electricity systems decarbonized is because we privatized natural monopolies that should be in the public domain. And if they were in the public domain, you could just say, right, lads, next capital expenditure round, you're just doing green shit. And they'd be like, okay, boss, we're done. Whereas if they've got to reply to shareholders, they're like, well, the IOR on this is actually like really shit. We're better off doing gas. We're going to continue doing it. So, these are fixable problems. We know how to fix them. It's just the political will to try and tackle it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm connecting my computers being powered by 100% carbon neutral electricity from city-owned, municipally owned Seattle City Light.
Yeah, like I say, it can be done.
Yeah. Also, relatively inexpensive. Not the cheapest, because it's cheaper to burn coal when you've got a plant near a coal mine. But
Well, thank God for that executive order restoring America's beautiful coal industry. I love using the adjective beautiful in front of the word coal industry is a violation of English that no one's ever done before.
So while we're on the subject of energy, I've been thinking a lot about the future, and you mentioned in the book that, and it's pretty obvious, one of the most volatile components of the inflation index is energy.
Yeah.
Because oil prices, fluctuate wildly depending on
another solvable problem, by the way.
Yeah, depending on who we're bombing.
Yeah.
And at what time and how the markets react to that. As the economy electrifies, and we presume it will electrify, despite what Trump does, it's just going to do that over time. 20 years out, electricity prices are far less volatile.
Right.
Will that mean there will be less volatility in inflation if most of our energy is coming from an electric grid that is less volatile?
Yeah, it depends if we piss it all away on AI data centers that we don't need. There's an entirely different thing on that one, right? But hold that constant for a minute. Electricity is probably about 60% of energy consumption, even if you make it 100% green, right? If you still want to fly, you still want fertilizer, you still want plastic feedstock, there's still going to be a role for carbon, right? It's just we're never getting off of that, and that just has to be addressed. The really interesting one, though, for inflation going forward is climate change. All right, think about what happens in terms of big rainstorms, then you get drying, then you get another rainstorm, then you're washing off topsoil. There's lots of changes in agriculture. There's lots of changes in food webs, entire sort of bioecosystems. All of that is basically coming into question as we warm. Potsdam Institute on Climate Change Research already done some numbers on this. They already think and can show statistically that climate change effects are pushing into food inflation. And if you have a highly unequal society, whereby that skew means that a very large number of people are going to suffer inflationary pressures, and you know that there's inflationary pressures coming through, and then you spend 20% of your GDP building data centers for an AI god that can't be built, that's a very inefficient use of resources.
But look at all the money homeowners are saving on homeowners insurance now that nobody can afford to pay for it. Because once you don't have homeowners insurance, that's a big expense right out of your budget.
Yeah, but it also means that mortgages can't be written because ultimately you need insurance on the mortgage, and that's going to contract your home building sector, and that is not good news for employment. Well, so we'll see. But these are the types of nonlinear effects, right? You're absolutely right to focus on insurance. That's a super important one, and we're already seeing the prices of that going up. So again, remember, let's go back to where we started. So it's a rise in the general level of all prices. What are the type of things that would make all prices rise? How about the entire planet getting hotter? That's the one you got to think about.
Right. Oh, but Nordhaus says it's just like a few points off of future GDP, so we don't need to worry about it.
Well, that's good because, and one of his collaborators said we can all just work inside like the Saudis do. So we're in good hands, lads. We're in good hands.
Oh, my gosh. Well, final question. Why do you do this work?
Because every day I think about opening up a nice lunch cafe and just doing breakfast and lunch and shutting it down so I don't have to think about all this stuff. I think about all this stuff and write about all this stuff because it's important. And I think that particularly now, as we have exactly an economy where 12.5% of GDP is corporate profits and we're all meant to think that's a great thing, that, the more I can do to educate normal people, I don't write for academics in books, I write for normal people, about sort of how I think about the world, and if people find that useful in helping them sort of sort through the bullshit, then, I've done my bit. And that's why anybody should do this stuff.
Yeah, that's great. Well, as always, it's a pleasure to have you on.
And, always good to see you guys. Always great to chat. Let's not leave it a year next time.
Yeah. Well, you need to write more books.
Yeah, I suppose that's the case.
or just think a great, annoying thought. We'll have you on.
Sounds good. I think I can do that.
Yeah.
You got to be careful. You add too much diversity to economic thinking, and Trump's going to shut down Brown University.
I think that's meant to be on the menu anyway. Hopefully he's distracted enough now that that's not happening.
Yeah.
Oh, I regret, Nick. I meant to ask Mark this question. The subtitle of the book is Inflation, a Guide for Users and Losers. But that's actually not entirely the frame he uses in the book. He talks about users, losers, and winners. But there are winners from inflation, too.
Yeah.
And it's part of the story that nobody likes to talk about. If you have a loan at a fixed rate and you get this bout of inflation, you are a winner.
Yeah.
Right?
Big time. Yeah. If you hold large amounts of debt
at fixed rates.
At fixed rates.
Remember, at fixed rates, not credit card debt. No, because those interest rates go up.
Yeah. But if you have a 30-year mortgage.
Yeah. If you had a 30-year mortgage at 3% and inflation hit 9%, you're coming out ahead.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. When we talk about how complicated this issue is, Nick, it's not just how do we properly measure inflation? Is it headline inflation? Is it core inflation? Does that represent what inflation really is? It's not just a question of how we respond to it. Do we do it with monetary policy? Do we do it with fiscal policy?
Right.
Do we do it with investment? A lot of people derided the name, the Inflation Reduction Act, because it was mostly just a series of investments. But in fact, we were investing in creating supply, and it was a supply chain shock. I mean, one of the reasons why used cars went up 40% in the midst of the pandemic was that there was a shortage of new cars because there were a shortage of semiconductors, which were used in the new cars. So we couldn't actually finish manufacturing those new cars, so therefore people were forced into the used car. It's not like used cars suddenly became more expensive to make. They were right. The price was driven up because of all these things going down the supply chain. So when you bring some of the semiconductor manufacturing back home, you are creating a little bit of protection against these sort of supply chain shocks in the future. So it's complicated there. Do you do price controls? Do you regulate antitrust? All these various things that you can use to address inflation. It's complicated whether inflation is good or bad in general. Do we want 2%? Do we want 3%? What's the proper rate? Yeah. But it's also really, really, really complicated in terms of who it affects. And as he points out, it affects poorer people more because they spend all of their money. Right. People in the bottom half of the distribution are going to spend everything, so all their prices are going up, right? So whereas somebody like you isn't really affected at all. And me, thanks to you, not as much because you pay me decent, right?
Yeah.
So, I wasn't really worried about making ends meet, though a decade earlier I would have been.
Yeah, right.
That gets to, like everything, and we talk about a lot, inflation is a distributional issue. It redistributes in the economy. And the question is from whom to whom, over what period of time, and how do we respond to that? And that's something which Larry Summers didn't want to talk about in his tweets.
Yeah, right. Fun conversation. Interesting subject.
Again, if you want to read more from Mark, there is a link in the show notes to his book, Inflation, a Guide for Users and Losers.
Pitchfork Economics is produced by Civic Ventures. If you like the show, make sure to follow, rate, and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on other platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at Pitchfork Economics. Nick's on Twitter and Facebook as well, at Nick Hanauer. For more content from us, you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Pitch, over on Substack. And for links to everything we just mentioned, plus transcripts and more, visit our website, pitchforkeconomics.com. As always, from our team at Civic Ventures, thanks for listening. See you next week.